Wow, this is a true, I guess you'd call it a barn find. Look at that. That's some 10-year-old dust sitting there. Today we've got a 550 here that's been sitting in someone's backyard for 15 years. So we're going to resurrect it, we're going to make it run, we're going to go to the water, we're going to test it, and we're going to make it better, maybe a little faster, and a lot more reliable. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look the ski over and see what we need to do to it. If there's anything obvious we want to check. So obviously this is the front bow eye here. This is called a bow eye. This is a bushing. They make them out of aluminum, but this one's okay. We don't need to touch it. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to check the fuel cap. We wiggle it a little and then see that it doesn't lift anywhere. That means the threads are not broke. If these threads will break, and if they break, you're going to leak water into the fuel. That's bad. There's a rubber gasket here that would be easier to show you if it was broke. These are always broke. And you'll see a split there. And this one's perfect, otherwise it needs to be replaced. And you always want to make sure there's that gasket there. That's critical. This is all in good shape too. There's no tears, no rips. If this is broke here, water will get into the hull. If this is broke through here, water will get in the fuel. Those are all bad scenarios. This thing is in really good shape. The only thing I see is the chain is not connected. So we'll fix that real fast. Or not. Come on. So we fix that now that we will not lose our gas cap. Okay, so that was an easy fix. Now we'll move on. So the front of the ski is in good shape. We go to the handle pull. We do this. That's bad. The handle pull moving side to side is bad. Right here's bushings. We'll replace these bushings and we'll deal with that later. That definitely goes on the list. Next thing is the throttle cable. Throttle cable's in good shape. It does everything it's supposed to do. It's not sticking or binding. Steering is okay. Start-stop switch looks okay. Nothing broke. We definitely need grips. And it looks like the steering plate's loose. That's adjustable. And I don't like these handlebars being bent this way because it makes it difficult to steer. So we'll either replace the bars or we'll bend them straighter. Next thing is the hold down for the lid. It's a rubber band. And as you can see, it has good pliability. I'm going to take that off. That looks good. And then we're going to check our reserve on here. Actually, that doesn't matter because we're not going to use that because ethanol. This was designed before ethanol fuels, and ethanol ruins these. So we're going to bypass that. And the choke. Choke is good. That doesn't need to be addressed. Let's look at the hood. Wow, this is a true, I guess you'd call it a barn find. Look at that. That's some 10-year-old dust sitting there. Okay, the hood seal looks okay. It's still soft and pliable. We're going to look at all this. We're going to rotate the motor over to see if it sounds okay. If it sounds okay, we'll do a compression check. If the compression check checks out good, we'll probably pull the motor and do crank seals because we never trust crank seals on a motor this old. They're only 20 bucks for the new crank seals. We'll replace them. This thing here is a check valve. This is the factory OEM check valve. It's plastic. So I guarantee you that's going to leak. Yeah, I'd be willing to bet money that's going to leak. So that'll be replaced. So we'll get set up to do a compression check here. I'll go ahead and change the battery with a good battery. The motor sounds okay. I want to do two things. I want to test for spark and I want to test for compression before we take it all apart. That way we know it's going to run or not. If it's not going to run when we have it apart, we'll diagnose it. If it is going to run, all we have to do is take it apart, repair things, and then we'll go back together and ride. So this is a spark checker. We're going to check for spark. We got a nice hot spark there, a nice hot spark there. That's a good sign. Brand new plugs too. And they're the wrong ones. They're always the wrong ones. And they're wrong in two different ways here. All right. Okay. 120, that's a little on the low side, but we'll see what the front one looks like before we condemn the motor. Okay, so we're 125 to 130, which is on the low end of what we like. But what you don't know is it's 118 degrees outside. The density altitude is over 2,000 feet right now. So factoring all that in, we're within the specs of the motor. So when we get the motor apart, we'll look at it. If there's nothing screaming overhaul it, then we're not going to. Okay, so the compression gauge I'm using, guys, is a Mac compression gauge, Mac Tools. I've had this thing like 30 years. What people don't know is what makes a compression gauge work as well as it does is the Schrader valve. It's the same Schrader valve that's in a tire or not. A tire valve has a harder spring in it. So if you go to the chain stores and buy one of those compression gauges, chances are it's going to have a stronger Schrader valve because the company cut corners and bought tire valves to put in there. The higher end tool companies, Snap-on, Mac, Matco, Cornwell, they all use a specialty Schrader valve for compression gauges. The nice thing about it is they're consumable. So you can walk onto any of these tool trucks and ask them for a bag of these Schrader valves for their compression gauges and they'll sell them to you. And because they're the same thread as a tire valve, you can put them in your Harbor Freight, Sears, Craftsman, whatever. And they'll work just as well. So if you're getting inconsistent compression numbers and you wonder why, it's not your gauge necessarily, it's the Schrader valve. So don't be afraid to go buy those high-end Schrader valves and put them in your cheap gauge. They'll work really well. I just like I didn't know this in the 90s or the 80s when I bought my Mac tool gauge. I just knew that there was no Harbor Freight, there was no Home Depot or Lowe's, there wasn't these places to buy these type of tools at. You had to buy the good stuff. But over the years, I've watched the cheaper tools and what's happened with them, and I realized that a Schrader valve is, once you get the good ones, you can put them in these old tools and they work great. Now that we know the ski's going to run, we have spark and we have compression, the fuel system's going to need going through because the biggest tell is this air filter here. This air filter does not need to be on here. We don't like the air filters. If there's an air filter on the ski, it's usually to cover up bad carburation. I love K&N, don't get me wrong, but we don't put air filters on jet skis because as soon as water gets into them, they get wet, they start being restrictive and they wreck the carburation. So we put flame arresters on them. So that's the first thing we'll do is we'll put that on the list as well, is we'll swap this out for a flame arrestor. So now we need to check and see why these spark plug caps aren't going on. Oh, that one went on. So those are B8s, which is a colder plug than what's called for. So it probably wouldn't have ran right anyway. We're going to go ahead and pull the motor. So the fuel system is holding pressure. That's very unusual. I would have lost that on a bet. So what I'm really curious of, if the motor is even going to run, there's really nothing standing here yelling that, hey, this motor isn't going to run. Maybe we'll try to fire it up first and see if it runs at all before we tear it apart and go through it. It looks like somebody's removed the fuel filter from this thing, so we'll probably do something different on the fuel system to bypass this because there used to be a filter in there. So this rubber grommet here is important because it seals this. You got to have one of those always in these skis. And this is a newer style pickup, which is positive. They didn't use these until this model year. On the 650s, they started using those in like 86, but on these, they started on 90. So that's awesome. The fuel system looks good so far. We'll get rid of this, bypass that, and we'll the most important thing is going to be to get this motor out right now to get the exhaust off. Okay, that white powder, guys, that's our wonderful water out here. It pulls the calcium out of the water. Judging how little is in here, this ski doesn't have a lot of hours on it, and I don't think it's ever been apart. So that's very promising. There was 3 nuts on this, 1, 2, 3, and then there's two bolts that hold this on the side of the pipe, and an exhaust hose, and then that slides out and it gives us access to all the stuff we need to get access to. We're going to leave the rest of this on for right now. So what's really interesting about this ski is this is actually a unicorn ski. This was a 1 year only. This is a 1990. And in 1990 they were transitioning from the old style heavy drive shaft, heavy drive line to the rear exhaust and the new modernized drive line. You'll see all that when we get the motor apart and get it out of there. After this year, they went to a reed motor, which was the more modern way of doing things. And the reed motor was a smashing success. They actually kept making those all the way through 95. Before we started any of this, this ski had no paperwork. That's why usually skis that are abandoned and been sitting for years, they're not going to come with paperwork. So rule number 1 is you don't turn a bolt on these things till you get them in your name, because anything can happen. They can turn up lost or missing or stolen or anything. And until it's your ski, it's smart not to spend any money or time on it. So we did that very first. Got that taken care of, knocked out of the way. So that's a broken motor mount. I'll show you guys what that looks like here in a little bit. And that's what 2 broken motor mounts sounds like. So that's to be expected on skis this old. This ground strap that goes to this bolt for the electrical box, that's critical. If that doesn't have that, that's going to give you spark issues too. Yeah, all this looks brand new. This is very promising. There's never been water in here. The seal has been sealed all those years. That's very cool. Forgot the starter wire to the starter relay, so that's okay. All right. So you can see these 2 motor mounts are good. These 2 motor mounts, the plates have stuck to the thing and they've let go, so we'll replace both of those. Probably replace all 4 of them, but those 2 at the very least. Coupler looks good. Drive shaft feels good. Nothing wrong with any of that. This ski's going to be a good runner. These are Mariner grips. They were probably put on in 1992. And they've turned to gum, so we're gonna do. This is an air filter. These are for cars, trucks, motorcycles, stuff on land. It traps dirt, keeps dirt out of the engine. Dirt does not hover 16 inches above the water anywhere in the known world that I've ever seen. We do not use these. The reason people bolted these on back in the 80s was because if your ski wasn't carbureting properly, you could bolt this on and add induced restriction, which forced fuel out of the carburetor. It was a band-aid for a lot of poor fueling issues. We don't use these anymore. We know how to carburate nowadays. This is a flame arrestor. I don't know if I can do this or not, but you can actually see through it. This is what's required by law. This, if the engine was to backfire for whatever reason, any reason, and they do, this diffuses the flame and stops the flame from escaping out of the engine and blowing your hood off or blowing any kind of, you know, gaseous stuff in the hull. It blows it up. A lot of people have been hurt. You can watch videos all day long on the problem of, you know, not having a flame arrestor when they need one. These are required. These are what we want. This is what we'll use. They yield more power, more airflow, and they don't restrict the carburetor. So we'll go ahead and tune the ski properly, and we'll go with what works. Ooh. That bolt broke. And this one's going to break right behind it. Or it's going to pull out the entire... Someone's been in here already. They pulled out the entire insert. Oh no, that's the factory insert. Huh. Okay, we'll fix that. This one here is no good. So we'll have to fix that too. That's why we take stuff apart, because we find stuff like this on these old skis all the time. Has an aftermarket impeller. That's promising. It looks like it's in really good shape, so we may leave that alone. As you saw from our intake track video, we're putting this pump stuffer in, but I wanted to show you guys the there's a lot of very strange silicone down here, remnants and residue. That does ill things to the water when you're dealing with a pump intake track. So we're going to clean all that up before we glue this in. The pump stuffer is drying. I've looked through all this back here. The impeller's in really nice shape. The pump's in nice shape. The steering nozzles, everything's in good. Like, this is a low hour ski. We've gone over these inserts. I'm gonna replace these inserts. That's an easy task. And the only other thing I see I don't like is this non-stainless hose clamp. So we're going to take that off, because that will rear its head in a bad way at some point when we least expect it. Okay, perfect. We'll replace those, put the ride plate on. We'll put the intake grate on once this dries, and we'll be done with the bottom. We'll be ready to flip the ski over and move forward. Guys, wattcon.com. The hole inserts worked like factory. And in case you're wondering, it's a 7/16 tap that tapped the holes. And we're going to put the ride plate on. Intake grate is on and tight. The pump stuffer's on and glued and down. And so we pulled the 550 motor out. We pulled the head off. And just as I kind of suspected, this is the stock pistons, okay? And as you can see, they're very worn out, okay? That explains our lower compression numbers. And we're gonna go over this a little bit, but basically what looks like what happened is somebody bought this ski brand new. They put 30, 40, 50, 60 tanks of fuel through it and wore the pistons out. And then as it got harder and harder to start, they took it to a shop and never finished the thought, didn't pay the shop to go through it and put a new top end in it, which is basically what it needs. Now it needs crank seals because it's so old. But that explains the low hours on the ski. It explains the low hours that we've seen. I want to go ahead and demonstrate to you guys the ignition system. Because even if you follow the service manual, I have seen ignition systems spec out on the voltmeter and they're still bad. So this is my way of testing the ignition systems. We know this one produces spark, but we're gonna go ahead and go through this anyway. On a Kawasaki and a Yamaha actually, whenever you see two wires the same color, that's always gonna be your AC, your charging circuit. The ignition systems on these skis have two circuits. You have one to charge the battery, which is its own circuit, and then you have our pickup coil that runs your ignition. Okay, that's a separate circuit. So when you see two wires of the same color, that's always your charging circuit. They're different colors on every model of Kawasaki jet ski. I don't know why. And Yamahas, I think, are different as well. Most of the time, Yamahas are brown, I think. But my point, though, is the way I test these, we're going to hook up a voltmeter to these little guys here. Okay. Oop. Okay, so we got our two wires here. All right, we're going to go to the voltmeter. The voltmeter is always going to be on alternating current because this is an AC generator when the motor's turning over. So we have 22 volts, okay? 22 volts will step down to 14 volts for the charging system. And we use a rectifier. That's a good solid voltage. It has to be over 14 volts because if it's not, you can only step voltage down for a charging system. So it has to be more than 14 or 15 volts. As you can see, we got 20 volts strong, and that's just on startup. That's just on cranking RPM. On the 550s and the 440s, we have two wires for the ignition coil circuit. Now, I don't know why they run two, but you can see we have a red and a gray wire. The black wire is always ground. So we're going to test these two circuits here with one on the ground wire and one on the red. Test the red one first, and we'll do the same thing. So 62 volts, that's a good strong voltage, and then the CDI, the ignition component, will step that voltage up to 10,000 volts to run the ignition coil. That's what gives our spark and our gap. And because we have two of them here, we're going to test the other one as well, and it should be pretty comparable. Yeah, 83 volts. That's a good strong, that's probably the strongest 550 ignition I've ever tested. But that's how I like to test them, because that way you know exactly what you got. If those voltages fall, it'll still pass the ohm test, but you won't make RPM, and you'll never, it's hard to figure out that that's what's causing the problem. So that's why I do that. I do have the head off, and when you take the head off, it unbolts the studs that holds the cylinder down. I did put a spacer and a nut down so it wouldn't pop the cylinders off when I'm doing this and damage anything. But what I wanted to show you guys here as well is I actually have a feeler gauge set up here, and as you can see, it goes down. This is 11 thousandths. Now you're going to say, what does that mean? It doesn't really mean anything. We're going to take the motor apart. I like using feeler gauges just for a off-the-cuff test because the piston's tapered, but over the years, as the piston wears, the piston gets smaller. The hole stays the same size. The piston gets smaller. And on these motors, because you don't have a reed valve, it uses the clearance between the piston and the cylinder wall with oil there. That's what acts as a reed cage assembly. So as the piston wears, the oil film can't seal that and it blows by. So when one piston's going up, the other one's going down. And the carburetor, the fuel and the air mixture just goes, it gets passed back and forth between the cylinders. That's why these quit running. That's why I always make the joke, if you ever see a 550 for sale, they say, oh, it just needs a new starter. It needs a motor because they've worn the starter out trying to get it to start. And it does have measurable compression, it does have spark, it does have fuel, but people can't figure out why it's not running. Well, that's why if you look here on these pistons here, this rocking motion, that is a lot of movement. The motor's worn out. Now with a reed motor, any other motor newer than a 550, 650, 750, 800, they have reeds. They will run with a lot lower compression than a 550. So that's why we're going to go through, we're going to put a top end on this, we're going to put crank seals on it, and we're going to take the motor apart from this point. The flywheel is fighting us a little bit. So we've got the torch out. This, obviously, it's never been apart. It's all stock bore and everything. So we're going to throw a little heat on it. The key is to heat the hub. Try to keep the heat off where the magnets are. That's a big deal. Otherwise, you'll ruin the magnets. That's not working. $200. Oh my goodness, she's tight. All right. The concrete will suck the heat out of that and hopefully not damage any of the contacts or magnets. So we're going to go back to, and we're going to show you guys the double pickups here. And it's two things real quick. We're going to look at our stator. Our stator's never been off, so our timing mark is perfect. And so we're going to pull these two screws here and pull the stator forward so we can pull the crankshaft out. And as you can see down here, there's two pickups for the ignition. And I'm not sure why that is, because everything newer than a 550 only has a single pickup. I wanted to show you guys that this from wattcon.com. This is the puller for this piece here. I've already knocked it loose to show you guys, but this coupler tool fits in here perfectly. And ironically enough, this is the same puller that we're going to use on the larger ones, like the 1500 as well. Even though it's a larger size, the spacing and the dimensions are all the same. So this puller is a must-have if you're going to do anything on these Kawasaki's. Because if you try to pry on these things unevenly, you will break these ears off. So anyway, so now that that's done, we're going to pull the crankshaft and we're going to redo the crank seals. And what we've done is we've taken the crankshaft, we've replaced these crank seals. Here's our old seals, and they're in really bad shape. And we've put new crank seals on the backs, and then there's double seals on the rear. And we've made sure the crank, this is a pinned labyrinth seal here. This keeps the fuel out of one cylinder from crossing back and forth. That's in good shape. Everything looks really good. I went ahead and this is 1211. This is our crank seal, the crankcase sealant that we use. And we've laid a layer on down here, all the way across here and across here. And again on the case, down here the case halves, both of them are just a very, very thin coating. And then we're gonna put the, put this back on here, like this. Remember to do the stator first. Just like that. Then we'll run the bolts in and we'll torque them to like 12 or 13 foot-pounds, and then we'll be back.